right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to Marquette University Law School, Eckstein Hall. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people who are doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. Today, we are joined by a couple of very accomplished attorneys, and I'll do a brief introduction of each of them. Ted Ullyot, the gentleman on my far left, is a guy with quite a track record. He's involved in some interesting work right now in the Silicon Valley. He's a partner in a big venture capital firm out there called Andreessen Horowitz. Before that, you'll be interested to know that he was general counsel at Facebook. That's just his recent past. There's more to it than that. And then seated next to me is Judge Brett Kavanaugh. Judge Kavanaugh was with us a year ago to deliver one of our lectures. And he is back with us today. We are delighted to have him here. He has been on the U.S. Court of Appeals, the D.C. Circuit, since 2006, appointed by President George W. Bush. Again, he too has a lengthy resume that I could go into, but they are here today to talk about a shared experience, and that is the fact that they both worked for the President of the United States, in this case, George W. Bush. And we are going to talk about that today, what they did. Ted Ullyot was associate counsel to the president. He was later deputy staff secretary to President Bush. Brett Kavanaugh at the time was associate counsel, then became senior associate counsel, and then staff secretary. They have some pretty interesting insights into the jobs that they held, into the workings of the White House, the magnitude of the job of being president, and they're going to share that with us today. So won't you please give them a warm welcome to Marquette University Law School. Gentlemen, thanks. I think people would probably want to know right off the bat how you come to work for a president of the United States. It's not a job that many of us will have or hold. So Brett Kavanaugh, you went to work for the president first in this conversation. So tell us, how did you end up?
Well, we were supporters, I think both of us. I remember going to events for George W. Bush in
Summer '99.
Summer '99. Yeah, we were early on the Bush train. And in the fall of 2000, I was on something called Lawyers for Bush Cheney, a group of nationwide lawyers that was supporting the president, the candidate for president, the governor. And of course, then Bush v. Gore happened, and all those lawyers all got on planes the day after the election and went down to Florida, along with all the Gore lawyers. Everyone was it was just lawyers. It was exciting plane rides, just filled with lawyers going down to Florida. And after the 35-day situation in Florida, the counsel's office was staffing up, and President-elect Bush, had named Al Gonzalez, who was a judge on the Texas Supreme Court and had worked for him previously as his counsel to the president. And Judge Gonzalez then gathered resumes from people in Washington. I was, at that time, a partner at Kirkland & Ellis. We were working together at Kirkland & Ellis in D.C. and interviewed for the job and was lucky enough to get it. And when I got it, he said, show up tomorrow in the transition office. We had a short transition. One of the things about becoming president is how much you have to do to get the White House set up in such a short period of time. And this was historically short because 35 days had been lopped off for the Bush v. Gore litigation. So it was a whirlwind. I had worked in Washington, had worked in the independent counsel's office, had been a partner at Kirkland, and worked on a number of things. But it's like a lot of things, I suppose, in life. Right place at the right time, a little bit of luck.
Sure. Ted Ullyot, your story?
My story is Brett Kavanaugh. Not his story, but I came in a second wave to the counsel's office. And so I had been in the private sector, as Brett said. We had worked together at Kirkland & Ellis, literally, I guess not literally across the street, but overlooking the White House. We were on F Street there, 15th and F, and so you sort of overlooked the White House. We've been there, as Brett says, we had been both we had gone to some Bush events early on, and we both ended up doing some work on the campaign, a very minor amount of work. It's reading election laws in Mississippi to help the efforts of the guys down on the, in my case, whether it's Mississippi or what state, trying to help out in some way.
Palm Beach County.
No, because for me it was, I didn't, for reasons I can go into, I didn't go down to Florida to my regret, but it was earlier when you're just trying to get ballot requirements. So things like that. So you stay involved with the campaign. A couple friends of mine and friends of ours were down there as general counsel and deputy general counsel of the campaign. So that was my close linkage to the campaign. And then, but for me then, I actually went away from Kirkland and into an in-house job at what's now Time Warner. At the time, actually started doing this in the summer of 2000. We actually worked on a case at the very end of this. But so I had just gone into Time Warner when the election happened. I had been there literally about 2 to 3 months when this happened. So I thought I'd love to go down, and I actually went to the general counsel and said, I feel I need to be down in Florida. I need to be helping out with this. He said, I can understand that, but you've been here 2 months. You could do it, but it might limit your career at the company. People might wonder where your attention is. So I did not go down, but I remained interested in it. And as a Washington lawyer, part of the reason you stay in Washington as a young lawyer, I think for both of us after clerkships was with the idea of someday going into public service and doing something in an administration that coincides with your political background. And so we'd been on the outside for a while, and now starting in Jan 2001, there's this opportunity. And then literally it was Brett. I was interested in going into the administration in late 2002, early 2003. And we talked, I was thinking about a job in the Justice Department, and he said, hey, we're about to have an opening in counsel's office. You should come and interview for the job. So it's Brett.
Help people understand the role of associate counsel. What is it that you are doing, and what is it that you're frankly not doing in that role?
You're doing all the legal issues that the president could be facing and the White House staff could be facing on a given day. So it can range from the most important things you can imagine, national security issues, Supreme Court nominations or judicial nominations, to the most trivial issues of, boy, someone's using the president's picture in an unauthorized ad somewhere around the country. We need to prevent that from happening, or some issues of ethics. Can we accept a hot dog at this lunch, at this speech that we're going to give? All these kinds of trivial but important issues because everything's important in the White House, because if you make this is one thing about working in the White House, we all make mistakes in life. You make mistakes in the White House, it is suddenly critically important and suddenly national news and suddenly a controversy on the Hill and politically and there's stories about it. So you can't really afford to make mistakes even on those more limited things. But it's amazing on a day-to-day basis to go from, okay, we're working on some important national security issue, we're working on some domestic policy issue, immigration reform proposals, whatever it might be, to something that seems very minor. But they're all very important in the grand scheme of things. It's great variety.
Yeah, it's interesting, Ted Ullyot, that you're representing the people, though, too. I mean, the interests certainly of the President of the United States, but the people of this nation. There is kind of an interesting, distinction there.
Yeah, in a democracy, the president is there. He's representing the people, and so everybody there, you're exercising delegated power from him, or you're advising him, and so you are working for all of us. And one place we saw that was, you're mindful of that, and Andy Card, who was chief of staff at the time, and I think any good chief of staff reminds you of that before you start that last interview. You've seemingly got the job, but then they say, oh yeah, you got to come in and talk to the chief of staff, and he wants to eyeball you, make sure that he thinks you're up to par, and I think, and also convey a message, and that's one of his messages. We work for the American people, and and Andy used to say, Secretary Card, as we called him, he used to always say he'd say, plan on being here 12 months to 18 months, because that's the average tenure of a commissioned officer in the White House, and treat every day as if it's your last day. And we all serve the pleasure.
Because it could be.
Because it could be. Someday it's going to be. Someday it's going to be your last day. And if you treat every day, including your first day, as the last day, and have respect for the people. This is the people's house. This is not. It's not George Bush's house. This is the people's house. We're working for the American people, and that's the way you got to think about it. And then the example of this was, if you remember the Valerie Plame episode. The Justice Department began investigating the White House, and I was one of the young White House lawyers who was assigned to help represent, defend is probably the wrong word, but represent the White House in that investigation by main justice of the White House. And there, actually, formally as a matter of law, there's actually a DC Circuit case that makes very clear that you enjoy no privilege with, or the employees of the White House, the communications with you as the White House lawyer are not privileged. There's no privilege there. It's because we all work for the American people. And so does the Justice Department. So we can represent the interests of the White House, but we enjoy no privilege with the individual White House employees there in such investigation.
One of the things President Bush really stressed, and not surprisingly since we both worked for him, we're fans of President Bush, but he stressed how much the lawyers mattered. And if the lawyers said no, if we said no to something, whatever it was, we would get heat from people who there was some really important policy that people want to pursue, or some really important event, or they want to do something in a certain way. And if we said no, that was it. He would not push back at all. He would just say, legal says no. And that was a very good feeling to have. I'm sure most presidents convey that message, but it's really important to have that message conveyed, because there is a lot of pressure on lawyers in government generally, and in private practice, in the corporate world, but especially in the White House, to not say no, to find a way to say yes. And you got to have some backbone in that environment. And it's hard, but it helps when he's giving you the encouragement, and Secretary Card's giving you the encouragement. You have to have some backbone, because real problems arise, as we've seen throughout history, when the lawyers start blessing things that are problematic legally or otherwise. So that's one of the challenges of the job, and any job, and certainly for the law students who are listening to this. Having the ability, the willingness, the backbone to say no is one of the things you see how important that is in that environment.
I wanted to talk about some of the things that you both did in your role as associate counsel, and judicial nominations is one of them. Describe for us, and maybe you can begin, Judge, with this part of the conversation. We'll bring Ted into it because he was involved with that too. But describe for us that process. I mean, this is there's a lot that goes into it. How does it work, and what was your role in that process?
Our role was to recommend nominees to the president. In weekly meetings we would have in the Oval Office with the president, some members of the counsel's office staff with him, to go over vacancies and to go over with binders of potential nominees for those vacancies. Now, how does that work? How did we get the names into the binder? How do we find the people? And each state's different. There's really 50 processes. And because the Senate ultimately has to confirm the nominations, and it turns out each state's home state senators play a critically important role in helping the president find nominees for the district court and court of appeals seats in that state. So we would work with different senators in different states. So I would work with senators in California and Maryland and Pennsylvania, and you'd call them and say, here's people we've heard about who are accomplished lawyers or accomplished state court judges who are thinking about for these open seats, and they would give feedback. And they would sometimes say, no way, we're not going to support that person. How about my college roommate? That kind of thing. And we'd say, no, we're not doing that. How about we find someone else? And there's this process that goes on, and it's with Republicans and Democrats. And the reason it matters is because there's a process called the blue slip process in the weeds, but in the Senate, if the home state senator doesn't return the blue slip on the nomination, meaning that it can go forward, it'll never move. That's it. That's the end of it.
No hearing, no nothing.
They all defer to that, each senator's home state preferences. And you have to get both of them from the two home state senators from both, even if it's the other party. So you work very closely, naturally, to get approval and buy-in from the home state senators. Judge Sykes, a great example of someone who, a great judge on the Seventh Circuit who was nominated as part of that process working with the Wisconsin senators. But it can be a very challenging process. The president wanted the highest quality people he could find. He wanted people who shared what he thought was the proper judicial philosophy, people of great integrity. He was interested in diversity on the courts. So all those things we had to keep in mind when we went through the process, and those meetings were interesting meetings in the Oval Office because sometimes he was not buying what we were. He wasn't always buying what we were selling. So we had to go back to the drawing board.
It's just a recommendation.
Yes, it was not a rubber stamp. That's nothing was with President Bush. Yeah.
What?
Yeah, I think that's. The concept that I certainly didn't appreciate going in, again, and Brett was really the head within the counsel's office during my time of the judicial vetting effort, but all of us got involved in it, and as you say, the thing you mentioned about 50 state processes being different is something I didn't appreciate. I had no reason to know before going in there, but it differed wildly, and it was a question of political dynamics. Again, did you have one Republican, two Republicans, no Republicans, two Democrats? How influential was the governor? Sometimes the governor of a state would want to say in this, and that would depend on whether the governor had good relations with the senators. And that was all important to be able to get that. And so the White House had greater or lesser freedom to or autonomy in coming up with a nominee depending on the state. So that was interesting. I would say on the discussions with the nominees themselves or the candidates, you'd interview several candidates who would come in when you're trying to figure out who you're going to, what candidate you're going to recommend to the president. So they'd come in and you'd sit in, we'd do interviews of them, no litmus test questions. I promise you, there's no litmus test there. And I don't think Democrats have a litmus test either. You usually know. If there are issues you care about, you've usually seen probably in somebody's background where they're going to come out on these, but it's more about fleshing out the person's judicial philosophy and making sure they've thought about some of the kinds of questions that they're going to see as a federal judge, as opposed to either a state judge or a in-house lawyer or a trial judge or a law professor.
And the interviews were very important because federal judges serve for life. So once the nomination's up and you're confirmed, you're there for life. And it's so critically important for the president and for the country to get those picks right. So that was an important responsibility. And if people just didn't seem like they had the right temperament, because that's a huge part of being a good judge in an interview, you can sometimes discern that, or hadn't thought as deeply about some of the issues, that could really hurt people in the interviews. But a single district court, I sit in panels of 3 on the Court of Appeals, but a single district court judge is running his or her own courtroom for decades, and to have the right person and the right character and the right temperament's really important on that. The other thing about the process is this is not news, and certainly we're living through back and forth in the political world about this now, but the Senate confirmation process for roughly my lifetime has been broken in terms of how judges get confirmed hearings. So in 2000,
Do you have any firsthand experience with
yeah,
that?
no, it only took me 3 years, so that was not so bad. But in 2001, President Bush nominated his first set of judicial nominations. We really got in there, and to the point about when I got in there, and he said, we have all these vacancies, let's fill them right away. And we were pedal to the metal, and May 9th of 2001, so pretty quickly, he announced in an East Room ceremony all these Court of Appeals nominations, including John Roberts, who eventually became a Supreme Court nominee. And they were nominated together. I think it was 11 of them nominated together. As it turned out, over the next 2 years, only 3 of those 11 even got hearings. Think about that. They're nominated in 2001, May of 2001. They had, by 2003, only 3 of the 11 had gotten through the process. And there was a complete shutdown of the process at that time by the Democrats then. Now, one thing, this is a bipartisan issue. They were upset about Clinton nominees who had not gotten through because the Republicans then in charge of the Senate had not allowed Clinton nominees to get through, and they weren't just going to roll over for the Bush nominees. And this went back and forth until 2005, really, and there was a threat to do what's known as the nuclear option or constitutional option, and blow up the filibuster. It's not quite as dramatic as it sounds, and not truly a nuclear situation, but there was a deal reached in 2005 to get rid of the filibuster for most judicial nominations, but it really came to a head again in the Obama administration. There have been more problems, so we're seeing the fruits of all that, what's going on now, and I'm not going to comment on that, nor should I comment on what's going on now, but just to know, this Senate confirmation process for judges, anyone who was here last year when I did the Hallows lecture, it's been a mess for decades, and there really should be rules of the road agreed upon by both parties ahead of time to fix the process. But I've been saying that for a long time. So did President Bush. And
You'd like to see a time frame
Yeah.
established, a rule that says, these things must be taken up within X number of days. Is that what you're talking about?
yeah, I've said for a long time, and President Bush, when I worked with him and others at the time, he gave a big speech on this in October of 2002, saying at the time, he said, and I agree with this, every judicial nominee, the Senate should come together to set rules going forward, no matter who's president and no matter which party controls the Senate, that every judicial nominee would get a vote within 180 days. And he called on the Senate to do this, and nothing. Nada. That did not happen. But I think, it was a very, I'm a little biased on this because I helped work on it, but it was, I thought, a very good government proposal, the kind of thing you should do as president or in public service, which is to think about rules of the road, no matter which party's in control, so that when you get in a crisis situation or in a controversy, you don't have to reinvent the rules each time, which is a real problem.
Please jump in.
Another thing that I think I would point to is a nice step that President Bush made, and this is, you were there at the time, I was not, but I thought it was meaningful. You mentioned this May 2001 initial slate of 11 nominations to the courts of appeals, including John Roberts, including Miguel Estrada. You'll rattle off all the names, but to me what was most important was that 2 of the 11, so you're rolling out your first slate of appellate nominees, 2 of the 11 that President Bush put up, I believe it's 2, had been nominated by President Clinton previously and had sat and been blocked by a Republican-controlled Senate at the time, or at least not controlled, but by Republicans in the Senate at the time. And so I think that was quite a gesture by President Bush to say, I'm going to put on the Court of Appeals, highly influential, one on the Second Circuit, one on the Fourth Circuit, nominees that my predecessor had made, nominations that candidates who my predecessor had nominated and who languished in the Senate. So I thought that was, and I think those are 2 of the 3 that got through.
That you would be correct.
Yes. Both of you served as associate counsel at a very interesting moment in our nation's history. So you were serving at the time of 9/11. And so after 9/11, we had this really difficult challenge of balancing national security interests against civil liberty interests. What was it like in the White House working as associate counsel during this sort of new world that we found ourselves in?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're still dealing with that as a country, and will be far into the future, probably, the balance there of national security and civil liberties. On September 11th, of course, we came into the White House like any other day, and the president was in Florida, as everyone knows, doing an education speech. Education policy is one of the things he had run on. He had run on tax reform and education policy, Medicare prescription drug reform. He had run on several domestic issues. Very little discussion, if you remember back to the 2000 campaign, on national security, foreign policy issues. That all changed on September 11th, as he said many times. He became a war president. And coming into the White House on September 12th, just the feeling of coming in on September 12th and just the different atmosphere. And I've said many times, I think President Bush came in to the Oval Office as he did every morning, in the 6:30 a.m. range. That's when he'd usually arrive. On September 12th, I think he came in and said, this will not happen again. And I think every day for the rest of his presidency was September 12th. And for the rest of us, we all, of course, moved on eventually, still aware and concerned. And he didn't want the whole country to be paralyzed. He said that many times. But for him, for the one person who's in that job, he knows if something bad happens, it's on me. It's my fault. I will get blamed. And I'm going to do everything in my power within the law to prevent that from happening. And so there was a balance. All these old legal structures that we had that were set up for for traditional war, how do you adapt them to warfare against terrorist groups who do not wear uniforms, who attack civilians, who do not fight on traditional battlefields, who could be in the United States, living in an apartment in a city in the United States, or could be living somewhere in Europe and are not identified, and how to do all that on surveillance, interrogation, targeting. All those issues had to be dealt with. Again, military commissions, long-term detention, where are you going to detain people, how are you going to get information. One of the big things to prevent future attacks, which the current administration and every administration will be dealing with, is to prevent future attacks, you have to get information from the people by surveillance or by interrogation. And that presents a lot of questions. And this is something, of course, Ted can talk about a lot, but to what extent are we going to go in terms of surveillance as a country, as a world? Other countries are dealing with this too. And to what extent are we going to go in terms of interrogation? What techniques are going to be used to try to get information out of people who may well know where the next attack is planned and when?
Yeah, given your experience also in the social media world, working for Facebook, I mean, you have a unique perspective on this whole discussion.
I've seen both sides of it.
Yeah.
In my time at Facebook, really toward the end of my time there, I echo, by the way, everything Brett said about that. I think, and the key thing I'd say about the administration perspective, I was not in the White House on 9/11, so I never had that firsthand experience of being there. I remember talking to you, I think it was the day after, and hearing some harrowing tales of actually being in the White House then. I was at the time actually working in Manhattan, so I was working at Time Warner, and I literally, and look, everybody in this room lived through 9/11. Everybody in this room has stories like this, and maybe even closer stories. But my enduring image was a legal department meeting getting interrupted at Time Warner. It was a normal day, like any day it was. It was this proverbial beautiful day. I remember thinking that even before you hear that about the day. I remember walking to work that day saying, this is spectacular. What a day to be living in New York City. And then we're in a legal department meeting, and a woman came in 30 minutes late, just ashen face, and said, 2 planes have gone to the World Trade Center. It looks like a terrorist attack, and no one knew what to think of this. But we went upstairs, and you could literally see the World Trade Center burning. And then I remember watching it at one of my colleagues' offices, and we weren't watching the TV, just watching it live. Then you saw the tower fall. And you just had no idea what it was. I remember saying, I think one of the towers must have just fallen down. And it was insane. But that was, by the way, just on a personal note, that was among the things that redoubled my interest in going into the administration. Certainly. Just saying, I can't do anything on the battlefield, can't do anything of serious note, but at least maybe I can help with some, do some lawyering there. But anyway, on the Facebook side, then seeing it from the other perspective, I do think these are very hard questions, and you have serious people, both in the Bush administration, the Obama administration, trying to wrestle with them. In the political arena, I think it's easy to bash both sides. It's easy to say, well, you're a war criminal because you're engaging in strict interrogation of people and keeping them in Guantanamo, or you're a peacenik and you're not defending the country enough, and that tends to happen there. But I think you have very serious people at the Justice Department, at the NSA, at the White House, wrestling with very hard questions, the judge is saying, questions of first impression that, some of the cases, some of the precedents that the Justice Department looked at here were literally World War II cases about picking up a boat full of German saboteurs who landed on the shore in Long Island. I mean, these are old cases that nobody's thought about for 60 years at that point. Hard questions. Facebook then, we face obviously the Snowden revelations in 2013. And so we're on the other side of that balance. And now you see Silicon Valley making, they're at strong odds with the FBI in this whole Apple FBI episode. And that is this constant swinging of the pendulum between national security, which France is feeling right now and so on, and we felt post 9/11, and privacy, which you tend to emphasize more when you're farther away from these dangers. And just goes back and forth and back and forth.
I think one of the things we've seen is the Bush administration in the immediate weeks and months afterwards adopted some new policies. Some were good, some were probably too aggressive and were scaled back over time, and there was an adjustment period, as you would expect over time. Some were very controversial and were not scaled back, but some were. And there was, because we didn't have a playbook, the country did not have a playbook for this, the White House didn't, it was a trial and error period, but then came to some settled understandings, acts were passed with Congress, legislation was passed, and then the Obama administration came in. And I think one of the things that's probably been good as a country in terms of the lawyering on this issue is you've had now a Republican administration and a Democratic administration both dealing with the same issues. And there's been, I think, a remarkable degree of consensus that is built up now. There's still a lot of controversial issues, but a remarkable degree of consensus among between two administrations about how to deal with some of these problems, and really worked through it pretty well. I think the court systems, I've been involved as a judge as well, the court system, the legislative branch, the executive branch. I actually think this is, the legal part of this has worked out reasonably well, and probably better than you would have guessed sitting there on September 12th, 2001, with some rocky moments. I will be the first to admit that.
Let's talk for a bit about the work that both of you did. You were staff secretary, deputy staff secretary. Again, I think there are probably people in this room who don't understand the role of a staff secretary. And when you explained it to me, I mean, there's a lot of pressure to get things right when you're staff secretary. What all are you responsible for?
You go with that.
So I was deputy staff secretary under Brett, worked in the counsel's office for a while, and then Brett said, "Hey, come on down to staff sec." And your question about what does the staff secretary do? That's a question I asked Brett. Well, what do we do? What does this office do? I'm
glad to hear you say that.
Yeah, I've worked here for a year, and I've answered a lot of staff secretary requests many times and signed off on memos all the time, but I still don't really know what this office does. But my take on it is it's a I think, Brett was just, I think even among staff secretaries is recognized as one of the best staff secretaries, most complete staff secretaries. Typically, it's a job filled by a lawyer, I think, because you have to have immense attention to detail. You're dealing with, among other things, any piece of paper that's going to go into the president needs to come through you first, and anything that's going to go out from the White House comes through you first.
So speeches,
policy memos, bills to be signed. You're in charge of the process, making sure that if the president's on the phone negotiating something very important, he just has 10 seconds to sign something. It better be right, and it better have gotten all the checkoffs from everybody. I used to advocate this at Facebook. I said we should have this at Facebook because if by the time something gets to the principal, and the stakes are a lot higher, of course, the president. By the time something gets to the principal, it better be right in every conceivable angle on this thing, legal, political, atmospheric, communications, messaging, all of that needs to be absolutely vetted to make sure that, that one cabinet secretary is not bum rushing the Oval Office and getting something signed off about, troop strength in troop numbers in Iraq or something like this, or a statement on the death of a foreign leader when you're going to enrage a minority community in that country because you refer to the person the wrong way or don't recognize a controversy there. The landmines are everywhere. And it's even to the mundane stuff, as we experienced many times. The year I was working with Brett, under Brett in the staff secretary's office was the 2004 year. So there was heightened pressure there because it was, of course, a hotly contested election with Senator Kerry. And as Brett said, if you screw something up, it's going to be news. If you screw something up in that context, it could be fatal. For example, if you called Lambeau Field Lambert Field, that could be bad.
As someone hypothetically. Yes, hypothetically, of course.
But also, so we would worry about things in our office at 11 o'clock at night when the president's on the road for an event in Ohio, important state, doing an event somewhere, and he's got the list of names of the local officials he's going to recognize there. Is the wife's name Christine or Christina? Is the husband's name, does he go by Bob or does he prefer Robert? Because you don't want to seem tone deaf. You got to nail all that stuff, and you need to figure out where you're going to get all that information. And so you work with all the offices in the White House to get all of this stuff right. Anyway, that's it.
Yeah, and each night you give a briefing book to the president with a binder physical binder. That's how we did it with President Bush, with all the events for the next day and tabs and who's going to be there and what's going to happen, and you're going to take 3 steps to the left, and this is, and all of that's set up. And inevitably, he would have questions. Why are we doing it this way? Why? You know, he was a demanding boss. He was very much. I don't think this is the public image of him, but it is the fact. He was incredibly attentive to detail and incredibly demanding. And if a speech draft he didn't like, we both experienced this many times, it was back to the drawing board, including sometimes, you know, the big speeches would be a weeks-long process, but some of them, he had to give several speeches a day, and you give a speech and he gets a draft the day before and doesn't like it. Well, you're there. One time he got a draft and he called me at 9 p.m. and he said, I want a new draft on my table where we leave stuff for him at the residence at 4:30 a.m. So, it's, you know, I want that, so get your crew together and have a new draft ready. I'll look at it at 4:30. And he was not happy. And that's the kind of work, because everything has to be just perfect. And you know, it's very interesting because you see everything. And as Ted said, one of the things to emphasize, and I think this is good for lawyers and students to know, you're a lawyer, but you have to be thinking about the other dimensions of your client. And in the White House, that is, as Ted says, legislative, political, the policy has to be good. Communications, if you don't communicate it well or you don't get it out to the press well, that's going to be a problem. And international. So a lot of issues have an international ramification. And if you, on any of these things, it could be, oh, we did everything right, but we forgot to call the key member of Congress who's interested in this. Oh, that's, you know, and that's a big problem.
Were there many of the moments?
Every day is just chock full of them. Are you kidding? This is a job where you are inevitably not achieving perfection, but you're trying to get as close as you can each day.
It's an amazing job, and it, as Brett says, gives you this phenomenal glimpse to everything from classified memoranda that go into the president. So you see that, to communications from foreign leaders that come out of the Situation Room, and they don't go directly to the president. Those come through staff secretaries. So you see this, you see what Tony Blair is saying to the president.
The magnitude of the job, isn't
Magnitude of that, and again, everything to the very mundane but very important things, like I mentioned, like the name spelling or the name pronunciation. Pronunciation was something.
Pronunciation was always a critical. Didn't always work out.
Yeah, there's some names even harder than Ullyot to right. But I always say it's a no upside job. Right, many.
Yeah, no one came in and said,
"Great job, you nailed that name."
No, it's like being an offensive lineman in football.
Yeah, left tackle.
They notice you when the quarterback gets sacked.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
or
you're
the
just
flag,
there.
or the flag.
Yeah, you get the holding. Yeah.
So you work very closely with President Bush. Take a moment to offer the folks in this room the memories you have of him in that role, but more importantly, the personal relationship that you have. What was he like? What kind of guy is he? Ted, I'll begin with you.
A couple things that come to mind for me, and then I defer to Brett, because Brett was very close to the president. But to me, it was, you know, he's I think he's just a great man. You'll hear nothing bad about the president here, but to me, in particular, what it was the respect with which he treated everybody in the White House, and in particular the permanent White House staff. You know, the career secretaries there, I think they still have a butler in the White House. You know, the people who had been working in the White House itself, the residents, for 30 years. They loved him. You know, the military aide. I actually saw, you know, Tubby, you know, Dr. Tubb, who was a military, you know, doctor.
Known as Tubby.
Tubby,
yes.
yeah, Tubby. Right. So you know, the president had a fantastic relationship with him. It was funny. There was banter back and forth. The president carried himself in the White House as, I'm no better than you. You all hired me to work for you as president, and I'm certainly no better than you. We're all working this office together. You know, he was very demanding and detail-focused with staff, with us, with the sort of political hires, as he should be. You know, we got to be doing our jobs right, but treated us with respect at the same time. He'd say, hey, I think you're doing a heck of a job on this. I think you're doing a great job. You know, appreciate the hours you're putting in, that kind of stuff. It was, you know, he really meant it, and he treated people with huge respect. The other thing, you know, well, I'll start there, and then Brett go, and I've got some reflections later, maybe.
Well, I echo what Ted said, and he really was someone who had great humility, I think, about the job, and was someone, he ran, this was what we heard in 1999, as a compassionate conservative. He ran to do something a little bit different in terms of domestic policy, and of course, after September 11th, a lot of that changed. He really wanted to work hard on immigration policy. That never came to fruition. He proposed a lot of things, Social Security, some of the things. But as a person, he was someone who I think was, as Ted said, so humble and so genuine to other people, and we would see it. So you can't hide it from us. That's the thing. We saw him in so many capacities that if he had been not like that, we would have noticed. But the way he treated other people, he's really actually a personal role model to me in how in the military, the relationship he had with the military, the relationship he had with staff, how he dealt with members of Congress, I remember his relationship with Senator Ted Kennedy was just this enormously affectionate relationship, even though they disagreed strenuously, most famously on the Iraq War. But they had a wonderful relationship. I remember the letter that Senator Kennedy sent the president when his dog died. And I thought, okay, this was just actually it said a lot about Senator Kennedy too, who was famous for the similar kind of personal warmth and personal friendships. And President Bush was very concerned about tone. The tone of our political discourse, I'm not going to talk too much about that, but let's just say it's not ideal at the moment. And he was someone who was very concerned about the tone of political discourse and working together with other people. And a lot of the 9/11 controversies made that very difficult for him to continue on because he would be receiving a lot of criticism. But he, I thought, always maintained that tone.
A couple things on there was a lot of things about him. Yeah, the dignity of the office, he cared a lot about that. The respect for the office that he was holding, and not just respect for the White House and the traditions and the centuries that have gone in there, and respect for the American people. Ultimately, that he exuded that. He talked about that a lot. And then I think the other thing that I remember is the things he did outside of the public eye that said a lot about him. For example, I remember he's obviously a baseball fan. He's a former part owner of the Rangers. And so he loves baseball. And remember, he'd do these South Lawn baseball events. Yeah. And so he'd set up a diamond out on the South Lawn, kind of amidst the trees, and with a fence and with little bleachers. And that's great. I loved going to this. And it wasn't a big spectacle. It was just, I would go there staffing him on the names of the Little Leaguers and the names of the players. But he cared about that stuff. And here's the key. I think most of the ones, and maybe all the ones I went to, it was disabled kids, that he was holding these Little League South Lawn experiences for disabled kids who would come out and have a thrill of a lifetime. With Darryl Green there, Cal Ripken would be there. I mean, Darryl Green football, but he'd bring in football, athletic superstars and big guys to go and play these games with them. So that's one. It's the kids that he chose to come in, those kinds of events, and he didn't publicize that. This was not a media event. This is on a Sunday afternoon, and it wouldn't be on the official schedule. So that would be there. The other one was meetings with families of fallen soldiers, right. Which, the few times I went out with him on travel, this was again 04, right? 04. So we're into the war at this point, and he felt that deeply, and he's talked about this at length in Decision Points, his memoir, and in plenty of appearances, but he felt, as he should, huge responsibility for the decision to go to war. That's a decision that comes down to one man, a lonely decision, and a hugely consequential decision. So when we would travel around, there would be time in the schedule again, but it would not be on the public radar. It would not be on the public schedule that's issued to press, where he would go in and spend an hour, 2 hours with a number of families of fallen soldiers. And so the point was not, I need to show the American people that I'm doing this. It was, these families have lost somebody very important to them. I owe it to them. I have to spend time with them.
And those meetings usually would be very good for the families and for him, but occasionally they would let him have it. But he still felt a responsibility to do it regardless, because that was part of the job. And he took that very seriously and tried to meet with as many families as were willing.
I wonder if you'd tell a quick story. We were talking about this at dinner last night. You had President Bush, former President Bush, out at Facebook for an event.
And that was a great example of his personality. I was, if not the only Republican at Facebook, close to the only Republican at Facebook. Yeah, former President Bush came out to Facebook in 2010. Facebook's still a pretty young company at that point. And the president had been out of office, I guess, about a year and a half. He had just written decision points. And so, as we were discussing last night, it was not my idea, and it was not the president's office's idea to do this event at Facebook. It was the publisher's idea that said, you're doing Matt Lauer, you're doing Oprah, you're doing all these, you're doing, Goucher, right? So you're traveling the country doing these high-profile things. You should do one of these. You should do one of these new media things. Why not Facebook? And so I got the call from a buddy of ours who's still with President Bush down in Dallas now, and he said, "Hey, man, our friend Mike said this. The publisher's saying they want to do an event at Facebook," and we both said, "No." And it just, it'd be the honor of a lifetime for this company to have him here, but this will end badly. This crowd is not a George W. Bush crowd. So anyway, there's a great long story, but the short version is we end up deciding to do it after a lot of discussion and a lot of debate between me and my friend Mike. And we were both skeptical of it. Then we decided to do it. Zuckerberg was extremely enthusiastic about this. He's kind of actually a middle of the road guy. But we didn't dare announce this thing. Bush antipathy toward Bush was still high, I think, nationally and especially in Silicon Valley. So we didn't dare announce this thing until less than 24 hours prior to the event, because we didn't want the groups to come in and protest and do this. But we ended up doing an event so we announced it's internal only Facebook employees, and we probably had 1,100 people in the company at that point, and 1,097 probably showed up for this, even with less than 24-hour notice. So that we had this cavernous, it was a warehouse really set up, and you couldn't see the back of the room with people, and I actually ended up playing your role, not as well. Who could? But so I was the moderator of this discussion, and he, laughs galore through the whole presentation, standing ovation at the end from a crowd that not only didn't vote for him, but really disliked him. And he didn't change any minds. Again, he didn't change anybody's minds, but he won them over with humor, with his self-deprecation, with his willingness. He has a great sense of humor, a great manner. So he was taking shots at Mark Zuckerberg, and Zuck was kind of speechless on this. How do you respond? He said, "I've never been on stage with a former president of the United States." And so he just absolutely won over the crowd. And the feedback I got from countless people at the company was, "Listen, that was great. I don't agree with him, but that's a very different person than the one that I saw represented in the media. And he's funny, he understands the consequence, he understands that people can disagree with him. I didn't know he did so much work for women overseas. I didn't know about his PEPFAR work on combating AIDS in Africa. He talked a lot about this stuff. He was enthusiastic about Facebook, about technology, but he absolutely won over this crowd. It was great.
Yeah, it's interesting how we think about presidents after the fact, including President Bush, and I think one of the things while they're in office, and I came to appreciate this, as did Ted, is every decision is 51-49 kind of decision, and many decisions are, okay, Mr. President, here's one option, it's really bad. Here's the other option, it's worse. And that's it. There is no other option. Those are your two choices, really bad or worse, and you can debate which one's worse. And that's true on the national security front. That's true sometimes when dealing with Congress. That's true sometimes with regulatory issues, especially in the national security field. And things become so controversial and so heated. I think, obviously, the Iraq War and some of the decisions he made on national security otherwise, and the war against al-Qaeda became very controversial. But I think you look back, and people then, it helped again to be followed in this respect by a Democratic presidency, him struggling with some of the same issues. You look back and have some respect for the difficulty of the decisions that he had to make and the responsibility he had to bear. And I think his good humor combined with that appreciation gives you a different view. I think that happens with a lot of former presidents. We look back and say, yeah, boy, we really were tackling that guy at the time, but in retrospect, a little grudging respect.
And a couple thoughts on this. One is you've seen that in the relationship that's developed between President Bush and former President Clinton.
Yes.
Right. They I've been to their sort of, I don't know if they came here, but it's to see them interact. There's deep respect, and actually, interestingly, there's deep respect for the issues that President Obama is dealing with and struggling with and wrestling with as well from both of them. So there is this former president's club and respect. One of the things that comes through in the way former President Bush talks about whether it's in his book or in some of the speeches, but he talks about being president and the approach that he took to the job, which I think it really resonates with me, which is history will be the judge. I did the best I could, again, making decisions, choosing the least bad of several really awful options, but I did the best I could with the information we had at the time. I wasn't doing this to try to burnish my own reputation or look like the good guy. I was trying to, especially in a September 12th mindset, I'm trying to do what it takes to protect the American people, make sure this never happens again. Maybe I didn't do everything right. History will be the judge. And then his best line, of course, they're still debating the legacy of the first George W. president, George Washington. And so they'll be debating my legacy a long time from now.
It is, and one of the things he said along those lines is you cannot be president and still searching for your philosophy. You have to go in with a set of core principles and a set of ideas and a belief in yourself that you're not going to be chasing transient popularity. And he would talk about that a lot. If you're trying to get a positive op-ed this Friday, that's not really what you should be thinking about as president. You have to be keeping your eye kind of on the ball and thinking about the long-term principles. And you're going to get, and he would say this a lot, you're going to get blasted no matter which way you go. And you're often going to get blasted by your own side. He certainly got criticized vociferously by Republicans on a number of fronts during his presidency, but that's part of the game too. That happens to President Obama and happened to President Clinton with Democrats as well. You just got to keep going and you have to be really tough in terms of not worrying about your popularity day to day. Obviously, in a political context, you have to be somewhat worried about having the support of the people, but chasing that positive headline for tomorrow is not usually the way to go, he would say.
I hope I don't offend anybody in the room, but we may just continue this conversation. I don't know if we'll do questions today. I hope that's okay, but there were really 2 points I wanted to still touch on with both of you. The first point is the death of Antonin Scalia. And since we are in a law school, I'm wondering if I might get some reflections from both of you on the importance of that. Ted Ullyot, you come at that from an interesting perspective. You clerked for Justice Scalia.
Along with your very own Dean Joe Kearney. That's where Joe and I met and got to know each other, was as law clerks to the justice. And we have another former clerk to Justice Scalia in the audience here.
What did you learn from him?
So much. Attention to detail, I think maybe on the most mundane, but attention to detail. One of the amazing things I thought about, you're a very young lawyer when you go into clerk. You don't really know anything about the law, and you don't know how it's done. And I think most people come at it from an appellate clerkship where you're dealing with kind of, not bigger issues, but you're at a higher level and not as detail-oriented. What Justice Scalia, before even releasing internally within the court a draft opinion, would do something called the booking process, where he'd sit down with you as the law clerk who had done the first draft, which usually looked very different than the final draft. He got rid of most of your kind of pedestrian writing and put in his own. But then before releasing it even internally to his colleagues, and this is remarkable to me, and really something I tried to follow in my career forever, but he would say, okay, we're going to book this opinion, and this is often even minimum 2, sometimes 2.5 day process, all day one-on-one with the justice in his chambers. And you would have booking means, okay, I've got the draft here, what we've ended up with. It has a number of citations in it to precedent. Go up to the library, work with the library staff, get every book and every statute that's cited in this opinion, and we're going to go through these one by one. So if you have a string cite, as they call it, where you have 14 state statutes listed in support of one. Great, let's go through every one and make sure. Back then, I don't know how you do it now. I mean, but back then it was an actual book with a pocket part in the back, so you had to make sure you had the updated pocket part to make sure the legislation hadn't changed. You could also look at it online, of course, but so you'd get these materials and you'd go through and this was, to me, it was Article 3 power in action, or Article 3 responsibility in action. You have this justice who's saying they're going through word by word and citation by citation to make sure that everything that, usually you would think, well, that's the law clerk's job. What are you there for, right? Aren't you as the law clerk supposed to do that? No, he wanted to make sure that everything was absolutely right. It was coming out under his name. This is law of the land. This is a U.S. Supreme Court opinion or a dissent or a concurrence. But he would go through this, and it was a fascinating process. And you learn things both ways. You would sometimes overstate something or be a little loose with that, and obviously that would get cut down and you lose credibility there. But more often, once you do that a couple of times, then you come in and you're too conservative with the way you're citing things. So he would get up, he'd cite 421 U.S. 375, 385. He'd look at page 385. He'd say, let's go look at the facts. So he'd leaf back into the facts. And then he'd say, you haven't done enough with this case, right? There's more. This is great. This makes didn't you notice this in the facts? This underscores our point even more. Let's go. So he'd go up to his computer. He'd put on his he had a John Deere mesh-backed baseball cap. He'd put that on. He smoked. So he was smoking a cigarette. I think they were grandfathered in from the public building rules in D.C. And he would just go, and it was amazing to watch him create, but it was the attention to detail that let him do that. On a personal level, the thick skin that you mentioned with President Bush, our year, a testament to our lack of, our lack of competence as law clerks. We were on the losing side of a lot of big decisions. So he was writing dissents, and he'd get blasted in the media about these dissents. Didn't faze him in the least. He had a good line one time with... Once, when he got confirmed to go onto the court, one of his then law clerks in the D.C. circuit went up to him and said, Judge, or should I call you Justice Scalia now that you've been confirmed? It was sort of the same day when he got back from the ceremony. Said, should I call you Justice Scalia? And Justice, let me say, 98-0. Remember, Scalia was confirmed 98-0, remarkably, in today's climate. He said, 98-0, Justice, that's fantastic. And Scalia said, Josh, never trust a man with no enemies. So that's classic Scalia, and he exuded that. He just said, hey, this is who I am. I'm trying to decide the cases. I've got a theory. I've put it out there. And so, thick skin, attention to detail, and again, very good humor. I think Joe would share this view, but I've not spent he's a warm man, very warm and funny. Very funny. And so I think that year was the year I've laughed most in my professional career, usually at our expense. It was usually a funny shot at you, but good-natured and letting you relax and feel part of the team that way.
Judge, a quick thought?
Yeah, from the judicial perspective, what a heroic figure in terms of what he did with the law. And what he really believed was that judges shouldn't be making up the law as they go along, but should be following the law as written in the Constitution or in the statutes passed by Congress. A very simple philosophy in many respects, but it's a sign of how far the court had departed from that philosophy at the time he came on, that he was so influential, I think, in returning the court basically to or near that philosophy of paying much more attention to the text of the Constitution, the text of the statutes. He didn't win every case, especially on the constitutional side, but he won a lot on statutory interpretation, on changing the methodology of how the court approaches it, and on constitutional cases, he certainly brought the court closer to his view. And if you read a case now, it looks a lot different than cases decided in the 70s. This idea that judges have a limited, important role to say what the law is and not to say what the law should be, that we shouldn't substitute ourselves for the legislative branch, that was really his core philosophy, and it had a tremendous impact. And again, his backbone as a judge. As judges, that's our job, to be independent and not worry about standing up for individual rights, even when they're unpopular. We have to defend those cases. We have to apply the law in those cases, and he would do that routinely, and so was a great role model for judges of standing firm with your principles, even though it may not be popular in the current time, which is the role of a judge.
I'd be remiss, Judge, if I didn't ask you one final question. That is about the possible replacement for Justice Scalia. There is a nomination. Merrick Garland is somebody you know well, serving with him. He's a colleague of yours. I know you don't want to wade into the political battle.
Right.
Everybody understands that as a judge, that you don't want to do that. But what can you tell us about Merrick Garland?
Well, I can't say anything about the process, of course, and what's going on right now, and that's part of a long story that I alluded to earlier of back and forth over many years. But I've worked together closely with him for 10 years, and he's a very well-respected judge on our court. He is very smart. He is very hardworking. He's very dedicated. He's a good friend. He's a good colleague. He's someone I would certainly look to for advice on things when I needed advice on them. So as a colleague and a friend, I'm proud of him, but obviously I'm also, from my history and from just observing, there's a process out there, and he'll deal with that process and go through that process, and I'm not going to comment on the process itself.
I'm going to wrap things up there. And again, forgive me. I know many of you, at least some of you, may have come here with questions, and I apologize for not allowing more time for that. But before we go, I just wanted to say thank you again to both of these gentlemen. We mentioned that Judge Kavanaugh was here a year ago. He's back here tonight. He's going to be judging our moot court competition, and that's really a gracious gesture on your part to spend time with our students and take part in that. We're delighted about that. And Ted Ullyot gave a great speech last night here in this room, the Nice Lecture. And I know you're a busy guy. You've got things going on back in the Silicon Valley. There's always something new out there to deal with. If they would only listen to you attorneys instead of the engineers all the time.
When we finished, when Ted and I finished our public service, I continued into public service. Ted became general counsel of something I had never heard of called Facebook, and so I read Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. Many nights. Proud of my friend, though.
Life tenure is pretty nice.
Yes,
right?
it's good.
But what I just wanted to conclude by saying how much we appreciate the time they've given this university and this law school. So again, a warm round of applause for Ted Ullyot and Judge Brett Kavanaugh. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's right.